Okay, thank you, everyone. I think if we can just start again, it seems to be a popular topic for discussion. So I hope that you found out something interesting from your neighbour. Judging by the amount of conversation going on, it sounds like it was an interesting topic. So we'll just move on. Oops. So choosing the right journal, best practices. So these are some things which we suggest. You should think about reaching the intended audience for your work. You want your paper to be read and cited. That's the most important thing. You should choose only one journal to submit to. Simultaneous submissions are prohibited. They're not allowed. And this does sometimes get flagged up. Hopefully it doesn't get flagged up very often, but occasionally it does. Your supervisor and colleagues can provide good suggestions and indicate which journals are regarded as prestigious in the field. Obviously, that'll be down to their opinion. There's some slides later on which talk about metrics and things which you can also look at yourself. Articles in your reference list will usually lead you directly to the right journals to consider. And you should think about shortlisting a handful of candidates and then investigate them further. So looking at things such as the aims and scope, making sure that your research fits the aims and scope of the journal. As both of the editors have mentioned, papers get rejected because they're out of scope, because people just haven't really looked at what the journal publishes. You should have a close look at the guide for authors. The guide for authors will contain information about certain formatting and things like that. Word count, which is important for journals as well. You should take a look at that. Which type of articles does the journal accept? Who are the readership? And finally, what are the current hot topics? So what's the journal publishing on and what's being cited within the journal? So this is an example of where the aims and scope is found on a homepage. All journals will have this clearly displayed. So Elsevier journals have them all in the same place under this About the Journal section, which you can expand to read more about these types of papers it accepts. And the guide for authors is also always found on journal homepages. And this is, as I mentioned earlier, provides some more practical details on how to prepare and submit your manuscript. So if there's any specific requirements that the journal has, they will be listed within the guide for authors. And it should also explain what you should expect in the editorial process and after publication as well. Looking at types of manuscript. So journals can publish different types. There are the standard, should we say, full articles, which are substantial, complete, and comprehensive pieces of research. And you should consider the question, is my message sufficient for a full article? Do I have enough to say to meet that criteria? Some journals publish letters or short communications, but you should check the aims and scope to identify that. And some journals will publish review papers. Some journals only publish review papers, but they tend to be journals which invite submissions directly rather than are open for de novo submissions. And review papers are always summaries of recent developments on a specific topic. If you want to look at examples of recent publications, this is an example here from Journal of Health Economics. You can see that you can select latest published articles, which will just show you the ones which have been published most recently, and articles in press. But you can also select to have a look at top cited, which obviously are the papers which have been cited the most within a certain period of time, most downloaded articles within a period of time, and most popular. And most popular may be driven by social media attention and other activities. Moving on to other things to consider, metrics, impact factor and site score. So impact factor and site score can be very important. I know that they're very important in some institutions, in others perhaps less so. Basically, they indicate how many times more recent papers in the journal have been cited on average in a given year. It is an indicator of where the journal sits in the research landscape in terms of impact, but it should only really be considered alongside other measurements as well. It is influenced by editorial process of the journals and the turnover of research, but like I say here, it can give you general guidance, but it should not be the sole reason to choose a journal. You should also look at where the journals may be indexed in other databases and abstracting services, and you can find this on all journal homepages. So it's obviously something to consider, but like I said, you should be looking at it alongside other things as well. And then some other questions to ask yourself. As I said earlier, who is the journal's audience? You need to make sure that the readership meets your research. So how fast is the journal? Speed may be something which is really important to you. You want to get your research out there as quickly as possible. How fast does this journal publish papers? And that information should be available on home pages as well. Is it currently inviting any special issues? So SSM's doing a special issue off the back of the conference. And we've had some questions about that already. So that's an example of a special issue which is being done in a journal. But other journals run special issues, and sometimes these are open for submissions, as a standard journal would be. Sometimes they're invite only, but sometimes they accept submissions from anybody. So that's something you might want to look at if your research fits the topic of a special issue. Do you want or need to publish open access, and what are the options that the journal gives you? And the next one I want to highlight, does the journal actually exist? So unfortunately, there have been quite a few what we term as predatory journals which have appeared in the last 5 to 10 years, and some of these frankly just don't exist. The Think, Check, Submit website I'll come on to a bit later, but this is a free resource where you can check whether a journal is legitimate or not. So you can put in the title information and so on, and it will tell you whether that journal actually does exist or not. And then the last thing is, it's worth looking to see whether a journal is running any prizes, which could help you. So some journals do early career researcher prizes. Sometimes they do an editor selected prize and so on. That's something that's worth having a look at as well. Elsevier has a tool called Journal Finder. This is a free tool where you can upload your abstract and the title of your paper, and it will give you some suggestions based on the information you've provided of suitable places to submit your paper to. Completely free. Other publishers have similar tools, but I'm from Elsevier, so this is ours. But it's worth having a look at. Obviously, you should look at this alongside other things. Sometimes the recommendations may not include the ones which you really want to go to, so that may come down to your keywords and so on and so forth, but it's a good tool to try. I'll now pass over.
Okay, so I thought it would be helpful to just explain a bit more about the sort of process of journal finding, but from the editor's point of view. So one of the things when a paper comes to social science and medicine is the two editors, we will look through the papers first of all to decide whether to send it out for peer review. So what we're really looking for at that point is this paper in scope for our journal, so for social science and medicine. So social science and medicine actually has a sort of statement which is printed out there of what it's looking for in terms of papers. So the first thing I'm looking for is the paper actually social science? So is it an application focused on a particular condition without any relationship to economic theory? If that's the case, it's not likely to be in scope. If it's not using enough methods to justify it as part of a social science type of journal, then it probably is not going to be in scope. So we're looking for papers that are of interest to social scientists. They can come from a wide range of social science disciplines, but it has to be social science. So some of the papers that come to us are very often they're very much sort of a bit like papers for the BMJ, if you're familiar with the BMJ, so the British Medical Journal. So they'll have a very short introduction, and then they'll talk all about the empirical data. And that's not enough for social science and medicine. It has to have that social science theory in there. Then the next one is whether it's health, which again, you'd be surprised about when a journal's called Social Science and Medicine, how many papers come to us that don't necessarily have a lot to do with health. So we're looking for things that have got health issues. A good example, actually, of ones I tend to turn down, because people are interested in DCEs and preference-based studies, they'll often send papers that are methodological papers about preference-based studies, social science and medicine, because economists use those, but it's not the right journal for them because they're not really health related. So again, they're not likely to even get as far as the review process. The third one, and this is where a lot of people come unstuck, I think, is the fact that social science and medicine is an international and interdisciplinary forum. So the papers that we publish have to be of interest to economists and to other social sciences. So if it's very, very sort of specific on a very, very sort of economic technicality, again, unlikely to be the right place for our journal. And similarly, if papers are very much sort of focused, I get this a lot from the US actually, but they're very focused on just that one setting and they don't really go outside that in terms of their introduction or in terms of their discussion, then again, they're unlikely to make it to get into the review process. Then another thing we're looking for is the paper a sufficient contribution? So social science and medicine is you know, it's a good journal and we want to have good papers in it. So we're looking for things that are novel. So it might be a novel application of social science theory, might be a new development of a theory being applied to health for the first time. It's unlikely to be appropriate. It's going back to what we were saying, I know, was saying earlier about things that are very descriptive rather than analytical are unlikely to be appropriate. Or if there's already a body of work in this area and you're sort of making a marginal contribution by doing the same thing in a different country, again, it's unlikely to be, or using a slightly different technique, unlikely to be novel enough and make enough of a contribution for SSM. Quality is obviously important. Often that's picked up more by, I think, more by the peer reviewers than the journal editor, because obviously we're looking across a broad range of things, can't necessarily be expert in everything. But if things don't meet those criteria to get out to review, then they're likely to be rejected without review. And I reckon, or our reject without review rate is about 70%. So of every 10 papers that come in, 7 aren't going to make it even to get out to review. So it's really important because you put a lot of time and effort into putting your paper together for a journal. So really make sure you're putting it in time and effort into getting the right journal. Just in terms of the process for SSM, usually we would reject without review within about 10 days. So you will usually get quite a quick response from us if it's not the right journal. So I suppose my advice really would just be choose your journal very carefully, make sure you understand the scope of the paper, read what it is, but also look at the sorts of papers that are published, because you can get a really good idea from just looking at the other papers in a journal to decide whether or not this is the right paper for your journal. And I would say always choose your journal before you write the paper, because you're much more likely to get it written in the right way for the journal that you're choosing. One thing just to add for SSM, which is a bit different from some of the other journals, because it is a general social science journal, you also have to choose the editorial office that it's going to go to when you make a submission to SSM. And I would do that properly, spend a little bit of time thinking about it, read what sorts of papers the editors are interested in. Because although we do reassign papers between editors if it's clearly not in the right place, you're also more likely to get a reject without review because the editor just doesn't really know what the contribution is that you're making if you choose the wrong office. So one example of that is we get quite a lot of sort of econometric methods, but social epidemiology questions that are much more likely to be suited to the social epidemiology office. So just make sure that you choose the right place for your paper. Back to you.
Thank you. So before we move on to the next section, does anybody have any questions relating to what we've covered so far?
Yeah, I just have a concern because I'm a demographer and I saw the list of other social sciences and I didn't see demography. Was there any reason? No, there's no demography. So population studies, nothing. Well,
I mean, the advice I would give is to look at those statements for each office and work out which of the offices is the best one to send it to.
Yep.
From that. And I guess the thing is, if none of them were true, then maybe SFM is the right thing.
Yep. Yep. And because I mean, we've got medical sociology and health, medical geography as well. So, you know, it's probably the most appropriate. Any other questions?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. My question is it acceptable that I present a situation of one article by myself or a manuscript, which I'm not able to submit it to a journal so far because it has been rejected and so on. Just still the question of which journal would accept the paper, even if they will reject at a stage. I still have trouble to know exactly what I will do. I have so far one paper as first author, and I'm struggling to publish a second paper within the frame of my PhD, but I didn't so far. If we accept, can I briefly describe which of study? And as I have 3 journals here, just to tell me if it's maybe accept for analysis. That's my practical question.
Yeah, I think you might be better to just have a chat to us afterwards and see if we think it's possibly right, or if we can make other suggestions as well, because we're quite aware of the other journals in the field too.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I have a very general question. Because in economics, at least, it's quite common to have a working paper published. Does this have any influence on whether an article is accepted or not? Does it depend on the journal? Yeah.
Yeah, that's something that trips people up with social science and medicine. So social science and medicine, I'm going to come on to it later, but we don't accept papers that have been pre-printed or that have been published as a working paper on the grounds, really, well, 2 grounds really. They're widely available through the internet, so people can already read them, but also it stops you from having double-blind review. So that's why we've made it an editorial policy. It's one of those things. I would say in the time I've been an editor at SSM since 2012, it comes up most editorial board meetings as a discussion about whether we want to carry it on or not, but for the time being that is the case. So it's worth being aware of that, because if you've already published something as a working paper 3 years ago, there is no point in submitting it to social science and medicine. You better go into one of the economics journals where that's normal practice. And the other thing actually is social science and medicine is pretty quick, you know, so the rationale that's often used by in economics for having working papers is that the journals are very slow, but actually SSM, you know, we try to be really quick. Our reviewers only get 3 weeks to review. You're supposed to turn it back in 6 weeks. So we are a quick journal. So that sort of rationale for needing to put it out there as a working paper isn't really there. I don't know if everyone wants to say anything.
We take working papers, no problem.
So if you've already published it as a working paper, go to him, not me.
Just a real quick follow-up question, because sometimes if you apply to conferences, I mean, it happened to me already, but they just publish, you know, you have to apply for the full paper, and then this full paper somehow lands.
So if they're conference papers or if they're theses, that's okay, but not preprints or working papers.
do that to sort of push social sciences and medicine a little bit further to rationalize the policy, because your rationale is based on the logic that social science and medicine is going to be the first choice journal. And yeah, I'm sure a high proportion of your submissions are first choice journal, but not all of them. So don't you feel you're disadvantaging yourselves a little bit there? You're not going to be able to get any papers that have gone to other journals previously, probably coming from the economics discipline, where publishing, well, releasing working papers is the norm.
We get plenty of submissions. I'm not too worried. I'm not too desperate to have more, really. I think, you know, it's a standard, or it has, again, it's shifting a bit, I think, in medicine with the pandemic. I think it has shifted a little bit. And that's one of the reasons we keep it under review as to whether it's a policy we want to carry on with. But certainly in medicine, that was always the practice previously. And I guess social science and medicine has been more aligned to that in the past. Yeah, I know. It's not just a decision for me, it's the whole editorial board.
Thank you. Hi, this is Ke. I'm from UCL, and I have a very specific question related to the data. So basically, would you say that different journals would have preference to like the local data, for example, for quantitative studies? Would you say that the local data would be marked down in terms of submission?
I don't think that would be an issue one way or the other for social science and medicine. I think if it can inform, if the data you've got can inform a general question, then that is okay. It's more about the quality of the data that you've got rather than how narrow an area it's from. I think that would be my answer.
Yeah, so my answer would be a little bit different, I think. So I think, you know, if you've got very local data, then it may limit the degree of external validity of your study, the generalizability. So, you know, for example, if you've done an analysis of, you know, one hospital using data from one hospital, but you want to tell the whole world that this study is relevant to the world, then that's a bigger stretch than if you've got data from many hospitals and you're able to sort of pick up a general pattern that you're seeing across many hospitals. So I think, you know, the narrower is the geographic scope of your data, the more difficult I think it would be. I think another issue in relation to that, we're getting more papers submitted where the data may come from one hospital, or the data may come from one geographic unit, say a district or a county, but we don't know which. Yeah, so the data are anonymized, and it says these are data from some anonymized hospital, an anonymized district. Yeah, I think that is an issue again, because it's more difficult to gauge the external validity of the evidence in that case. So I think those issues would be considered.
Okay, thank you.
My question is about providing replicating materials. So a lot of account journals are asking for replicating materials and also the data and codes. But of course, in health economics, it's difficult to publish data because most of them are very secure. But what about the codes and basically materials for users to help them replicate the paper?
For social science and medicine, we give you the opportunity to do that, and we ask you to say what you're doing, but we don't require it.
Yeah, so we would require either that you make the data available, or if that is not possible because you don't have rights to make the data publicly available, then you must make your code available. So it should be possible such that if someone was able to get the data that you used, you could use those data together with the code that you have provided to reproduce your results. So that is what's required now.
Okay, I think one more question, then we'll move on.
Just to add to that, of course, we do qualitative papers as well, so that it's a bit different because that is very difficult to anonymize.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Shahid, and I am from India. My question is, we sometimes got a rejection, but after review, and it seems like the comments we get from the reviewer, these comments are quite doable. Like we can easily do those comments. So, but we get since we get rejection, so and according to our thinking, like it should have been like revised and submit R&R. So, how do you see that?
This is a difficult question, which draw hands immediately to me. You observe. Okay, so our policy is that we do not reconsider papers that have been rejected. So if you have had a rejection and you were to resubmit the paper without invitation, then it will be immediately rejected again. So there is no opportunity. Now, so your interpretation in your case is that it was possible for you to respond to the referee's comments. That may be the case, but that's your judgment. Yeah. The editor has made a different judgment. And, reviewing papers and editing papers, it's a judgment. Yeah. A lot of it is subjective. And at the end of the day, you're going to make a judgment for the whole process to be viable. You've got to accept that there is a judgment. And once a decision is made, that's a decision that has been made. We just don't have the scope to go back and reconsider papers. There will be one exception to that. You may get a rejection letter, decision letter may say reject. The editor could possibly say, I've identified, you got issue X, Y, and Z. If it were possible after all, a substantial revision that you could possibly deal with X, Y, and Z, then I may consider handling that paper as a new submission, not as a revision, not as a resubmission, but as a new submission. Yeah. But unless you get that indication from the editor, then there is absolutely no point that you resubmit your paper.
Yeah, so you can appeal with SSM. So if you really think that the editors have got it wrong based on the reviewer's comments, you can appeal. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not successful. One thing I would say is that one of the difficulties I think sometimes is that what the reviewer says in the comments to the editor may not be the same as what they put in the comments to the author. So, I mean, I have had situations where they've put in the comments to editor, this is a terrible paper, do not publish this under any circumstances. And then in their comments to the author, they say, I really appreciate that the author has done this nice paper, blah, 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 blah. So that actually is really quite difficult to deal with because you're very conscious that you're sending something out that doesn't look like what you've been told. So that can happen. And the other thing I was going to say is we don't have in social science and medicine what you have said about you might be able to resubmit it as a new submission. Basically, if you get a reject from us, it's a reject. There's no point in sending it back to us. And we do have mechanisms to look. So I do sometimes get them like 3 years later, the same paper. But we do pick that up generally.
Yeah, just to follow up on that last point. So I sort of emphasized this point because actually we do get quite a lot of these resubmissions, and it's a little bit frustrating. And be aware that technology has moved on. We get a signal immediately that this paper has probably been submitted before. We get a count of how similar it is to other submissions, so you can tell immediately.
Thank you. There'll be time for some more questions as we move on. Okay, so we'll just move on to the next section. So the next section is looking at typical article structure and language. I'll pass over to Owen, but before he starts, some additional questions for you to consider. And again, please have a chat with your neighbour, person sitting next to you. How do you decide on the structure of your paper, and what support do you have in putting papers together? We'll give you 5 minutes to chat.
Okay, let's get started again. Seems like there was lots of food for talk, at least there. So I'm going to talk about article structure. I think before I get going, sorry. Yeah. So I'm going to use some slides that Matt has kindly provided for me. And I think I agree with a lot which is on these slides, but not with everything. But rather than change the slides, I decided that perhaps it's a good idea to keep the original slides, and then for me to talk about where I might do things a bit differently, and there might be some learning in that for you as well. Because, you know, writing an article is, you know, it differs from individual to individual, and it probably differs a lot actually from journal to journal, and even more from discipline to discipline. And as I think it's already been clear from a few of the comments we've been making, it's extremely important to keep in mind what journal or what type of journal you're writing for, because probably the structure of the article and certainly the writing is going to differ from journal to journal. So keep that in mind as I go through. So we're starting here with the sort of typical structure of an article. And I think on the whole, I would recognize this is the basic structure. So we've got title, abstract, and keywords at the beginning. I'll come back to each of these as I go through, and it's got sort of the main content of the article, the introduction, the methods, the results, and discussion. I think within that, there could be some variations. So you might see like the sort of latest developments in economics seem to be a sort of separate literature review coming after an introduction. Some other journals you might see that. My sort of own preference would be not to do that, to have the richer view within the introduction. But there is scope for separating those two out. And then methods, often the method section may be split into data separately from methods. I think this depends a lot on what type of data you're using. If you're using data which are a bit unusual or particularly complex, and it requires a lot of explanation such that the reader can really understand these data, you may need that in a different section from the methods. And then the other sort of area where things might differ is here. It has like a discussion section separately from a conclusion. Sometimes you could put those two together in one section. So apart from that, this is the sort of the main sections, and please do stop me at any time as we go through. So I'm going to go through each of these basically. This seems to take a while to respond. Is it going to respond now or? Okay. Okay, so this is a suggestion about the sort of process of writing, and the sort of suggestion here is sort of start with your evidence, if you like, with your figures and tables, and then work up to the sort of top of the article, if you like. I'm going to come back and sort of comment on that general process in a minute, but perhaps it's just a good idea to sort of point out that sort of a mistake, I guess, that some people may make is to sort of go in the opposite direction. You know, the first thing you see on a paper is this title, and then it's abstract, and so on. And so you might start off naturally sort of writing it in that way, and that's probably a mistake. So you need to, the sort of title, whatever's on the title page needs to really reflect the content of the paper, and really wisely reflect the content of the paper. So that's probably not the first thing you want to do. I probably would not start with the figures and the tables. So I think, you know, to get to figures and tables, you're going to have done a lot of thought before you got there. And whilst doing that thought, it's probably a good idea to sort of write some of that thought down as well. I think it's, you know, you're leaving the writing to the very end of a project. You can do it, but then you leave yourself an awful lot to do at the end. And you can perhaps make your life a whole lot easier by writing parts of the paper, or at least drafts of part of the paper, whilst you're sort of working through the project, not just at the very end of the project. So for example, at the very beginning, I guess you're going to be doing a lot of reading to find out, you know, how you're going to position, you know, what exactly is your research question, how you're going to position that research question and your contribution within the literature. So eventually that's going to go in the introduction. You're not going to write your whole introduction at the beginning, but as you're reading the literature, you might be wanting to make very careful notes and sort of start to write up a little bit of the text that eventually you will use in your introduction or literature review. Yeah. And similarly, you can only get to the tables and figures if you've applied a method. So you need to have worked out before you get there what your method is. And there'll be a lot of thought process and going through, working out, you know, what your general empirical strategy is going to be. And then within your empirical strategy, what precise estimator you're going to be adopting, what inference you're going to be using. So I think a lot of that probably you could write down your description of your methods, perhaps even before you get to your results and see your results. And that would be another way in which you could sort of start to build up the paper before you get to the very end. So probably I would sort of write drafts of the literature part, at least of the introduction, and the methods part would be the first things probably. And then, yes, you would get your figures and your tables, and then from those probably draft your results section. And after that, I guess I would probably go to the discussion, write up the discussion, and then work back to the introduction, the conclusion, and the abstract. Yeah. Any questions at all on that general sort of process of writing the paper down? No? Okay. So we can move on to each part. The title. So this is going to differ a lot between disciplines and perhaps to some extent across journals within disciplines. But I mean, across disciplines for us, I guess, in health economics, the big distinction is between economics journals or health economics journals and medicine and public health journals. And between those two broad groups, there's a big difference in the way in which I'm sure everybody's aware, in the titles of articles. So in medicine and public health, the title is much more descriptively accurate of what the paper actually contains. And in economics, you know, we go in for more how you might call them, silly titles, you know, catchy titles, trying to grab attention, headline titles, pop song titles. Yeah, we see a lot of this style. I think both are fine, but you need to be sure that you get it right for the journal that you're going for. Yeah, so don't try a pop song type title when you're going for a medical journal. That's going to go very wrong. And similarly, if you're going for an economics or a health economics journal, you know, a very long, descriptively accurate title is probably not going to work for you. Yeah. So think a bit about the title. The most important thing I would say is you want to give some signal in your title of what your main contribution is, if you can do that. So that someone immediately sees, okay, this is going to give me this additional thing that I've not seen before. It's a bit hard to do, but if you can do that, that would be a good way to go. Anything on titles? No? There was a noise at least. Yeah.
I'm reading in London, and then I sent the first title. I mean, to change the first title, and then I went and and put a new title. So by the third change, they put the first title and it was just corrected. So sometimes I think it's psychological for the editor. I sent the first, title was rejected. I sent the second one, it was rejected. Then I sent the third one. So that third one was the first one that I sent. Then it was, and sometimes it happened to some professors, maybe you have something on mind, you think this is wrong, but later you come to yourself, that is right. But I think that is human.
Let me just clarify, you're talking about different journals you were getting rejections from, yeah? With different titles, not the same journal, I hope. Okay. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. As editor, I would like to know what can you recommend us as the length of a title? I mean, the number of words, for example, to give a first good impression to allow you to continue to read the manuscript. Do you have some advice of how many words you can keep in a title?
Yeah, so I think it depends a lot on the type of journal that you're submitting to. So if you're submitting to an economics journal, you do not want a title that, for example, describes the nature of the data. So to say that, you would not say, results from a national representative cross-section survey. You would not say that. But if you're submitting to a public health journal, you would say that. Yeah. So you've got to look, I think the best thing is to identify the journal you're targeting and look very carefully at what it's publishing and the titles of those papers. And I think you'll very quickly get an idea of what's expected.
I don't worry very much about titles, to be perfectly honest. If I really hate your title, but I like your paper, then I'll suggest maybe a change, but it's not something, I wouldn't put a huge amount of effort into the titles. I agree with Owen, look at the sorts of titles that are in the journal and don't pick something that looks massively different from that. But to me, the title is not the key thing that I'm looking at when I'm looking at a paper.
Thank you. What's your take on including the study design in the title, like longitudinal study or something? Should we do that?
So again, I think, like longitudinal study in an economics journal, I would not say it, but in a public health journal, I would say it. In an economics journal, like the study design, like for example, if you've got a research, a regression discontinuity, you might want to say it, because that sends a signal of a very strong identification strategy which you're using. And so that immediately is a sort of selling point of the paper. Yeah. So not so much about the data, but perhaps a bit more about the empirical strategy for economics. Okay, so the abstract. So I agree to an extent with Joe on the title. I would say that the abstract is extremely important. I mean, it's really, really important. This is what initially the editor will first look at, and this is what the reviewers will first look at. So, you can do a lot of damage to your paper with a bad abstract. Yeah. Because if the abstract is either not very effectively telling the reader what the contribution of the paper is and given a signal of how valid the evidence will be, if it's not doing those two things, yeah, then there's a possibility that either the editor or the reviewers are really not going to give much more attention to the paper. Yeah. So you've got to pay a lot of attention to your abstract and getting it right. That means that it should be the last thing that you do. So you've worked through the whole paper, you've done a huge effort on a project. You should have really identified by this point, okay, what is my message that I want to deliver in this paper? And you want to make sure that that message is getting across in the abstract. Yeah. So you a little bit, so I can talk more for like economics or even specific to Journal of Health Economics. in the abstract, you would want not a great deal of motivation. So if you're going to have any motivation, no more than one sentence, but really no more than that. And then you want to really make very clear, as I just said, what the contribution is. You want to give a very, very brief description of what the general empirical strategy is at a general level, not at a specific level, not estimator which you're using, and not details about the method, but generally what's the empirical strategy, so we get some idea of what the validity of the evidence is likely to be. And then results, but not all the results. Yeah, the main results, so that what you don't want to do in the abstract is confuse the reader with just too much information. You want to make sure that the reader is getting the main information, the main message from the paper. Yeah. So those are the main things to be done, I think, in the abstract, and work at it again and again. Yeah. Until you really get there. Any questions on that? Yeah.
Concerning abstracts, can we use the same word or some sentences in abstracts and again use them in the main body of the paper?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, my second question is, what's really the difference between abstract and summary of a paper?
No difference.
I'm asking that question that I have been asked in a journal to provide a summary, and at the same time, somewhere in the same journal, I have been asked to provide abstract. That's why I'm asking myself if there is a difference between summary and the abstract.
Yeah, not sure. Joe, do you?
No, I think you just need to look at what the journal's actually asking for in those two things. I just wanted to come back to the point about what the abstract should look like. Again, it's really important that you look at what the journal is that you're submitting to. So we would want a motivation for your paper in the abstract, and we would also want something about the implications of your findings in the abstract. That's the thing I most often have to send back at the very end of the process to get people to rewrite bits of their abstract because they don't put that information in there. But I think that's very different. I see papers that have come from what I think of as real economists as opposed to health economists, which have very, very short abstracts, no motivation, no implications. So it is about writing it for the right journal, I think.
Well, I just wanted to say that from my experience, the abstract is short, very short and sustained, carrying all the key information. But the summary is a bit longer. And I just wanted to say, he wanted to know the differences from what he was saying. The summary is a bit longer, but the abstract is very short, looking at the key findings, methodology, in some journals, they tell you how many words you need to put in the abstract. Thank you.
Yeah. So it completely depends upon the journal. So like in economics, in health economics journals, we would not expect a structured abstract. And it would be not, I would suggest in that case, it's not a good idea to submit your paper with a structured abstract because it sends the wrong signal. Yeah, it's a sort of signal already that you're not completely aware of this environment of economics journals. So, but at public health journals, I think social science and medicine, you can choose. Yeah, yeah.
Hi, Owen. My question is, what you describe here is the abstract that we write at the end of our, writing process. But there's another type of abstract, like for example, the one we submitted to the conference, or for example, we have 2 special calls for this Congress, and that type of extended abstract we have to write before there's a real paper. What's your take on that? And
yeah, sure. So that should be very different. That which should be structured, I think, if you're submitting to a conference or to like this special issue call, You want to give much more information about what you actually did in this project. So it would be much longer and sort of structured so that it's very easy for the reader to see, what you've done at different stages. So I think it's got a very different objective. You want much more information in there.
Any more suggestion how to, substantiate all this information?
Well, I mean, you would want, so for example, in a abstract you're writing for a conference, you'll want to put much more about the data in there and much more about the method. And then in the results part, you want to convince that you've got results. Yeah. So, when you're writing, it's sort of a bit prospective at this stage when you're writing an abstract usually. So I think you want to convince the people on the conference committee that you've actually got results, that, you're not just hoping that you have results. So you write some results down there. Okay. Keywords, I won't say a great deal about this. I don't really know a great deal about it. I think one thing, Matt can perhaps confirm this or not. I think it's a good idea to use keywords that are not in your title, because if I understand correctly, when people are doing searches, they will find what's in your title. So you should use the keywords. I think it's an added opportunity to get your people to find your paper. So just putting whatever words that are already in your title is not helping in that respect. Matt, is that right?
Yeah, I would say so. So it's just going to help with visibility. I think as well, the other thing that keywords can be used with, they can be used to help guide editors when they're finding reviewers, because it can also sort of show what you are believing is succinct about your paper. So that's another consideration.
Yeah. So introduction. I mean, after the abstract, I would say certainly again, I'm talking about in economics and health economics, but after the abstract, I would say this is the most important section. And it's the most important because, again, it's the one that the editors and the reviewers are first going to read, and they're going to be forming a big opinion on the basis of the quality of this introduction. So for me, and again, this is very different relative to public health journals. But if you're targeting an economics journal, the main thing you need to do in the abstract is make sure that you've convinced the reader that you have made a contribution in this paper, and you need to explain that contribution and be convincing about that contribution. Yeah, that's what you're trying to do in the abstract. So I'll sort of run through the way in which I would go about doing that. But I would do this is the way I would do it if I was writing for an economics journal, if I was writing for a public health journal, and even if I was writing for social science and medicine, I would do it differently. Yeah, so it's important to keep this in mind. The way I would think, start by you want to motivate the problem that you're addressing in this paper. Yeah, so I would go for start out with some motivation which identifies why you're doing this research project and how important this research project is. What my target is, and when I'm writing an introduction, is that the last sentence of my first paragraph or the first sentence of my second paragraph, I'm going to say what I do in this paper. Yeah. Now that I think is sort of common in economics, but that you would not do that in public health. Yeah. In public health, you would have much more motivation, much more sort of policy context, problem context, and only at the very end of the introduction would you start to hint perhaps at what you're doing. Yeah. So it's really important that you keep this distinction in mind, because within health economics, that's one of the difficulties within this field, that we're sort of going across disciplines, and you can get caught up by not doing that, by whilst respecting the differences between those disciplines. So after I've sort of said that, and then I've said, okay, what I do, then you need to really substantiate what it is that you're doing. So you then go into explaining what your sort of main result is, what your contribution is, explaining how you've done that, again, your general empirical strategy, so that the reader has got an idea of how confident they can be in this evidence that you're delivering, if it's an empirical paper. Yeah. And then after you've sort of got that, then putting it a bit in the context of the literature, so what you're adding to the literature, how this contribution differs from the evidence which has previously been available. And then after having done that, I would then come back and go through, have a section which says the 3 contributions of this paper are: first, number 1, explain it; second, number 2; third, number 3. And there what you're doing is you're directly relating your contribution to the literature. Yeah, I think it's very important when you're reviewing the literature to avoid a sort of undirected sort of meander through the literature, which becomes a bit like a list of previous papers. Yeah, you want to keep your literature review very focused on your contribution. Yeah, you should only be talking about papers which help you establish what it is that you are adding to the literature, not just telling everything that's ever been done on this topic generally. Now, again, I think that differs a little bit between economics and other disciplines. Yeah, and then you move on to the rest of the paper. Any questions on that? Yeah.
So personally, whenever I start writing introduction, so I have this, actually, I'm always in the dilemma of what should be the storyline. Let's say, for example, I'm working in the inequality of some health variable. So how should I start my introduction? It should focus directly on the health inequality in the economy, or should it start directly from the health variable only? So what is your take on this?
So I think you want to, it's good to start with the motivation by identifying the problem which your paper most directly speaks to. Yeah. So you would, health is a very important issue, and even within, let's say you were working on something, say on cardiovascular disease. Yeah. And so you could start off by telling the world how, a big disease burden there is from cardiovascular disease. Yeah. But that's still very, very broad. Yeah. And so presumably you're doing something which is much, much more specific within cardiovascular disease. So it's a good idea to try to, as early as possible, give some signal of what it is about cardiovascular disease which you are going to contribute to, before you even get to what you are doing, but still so that the reader is getting an idea, okay, I'm within this particular area. Yeah. So try to, it's a tricky balance, because on the temptation is to go very, very wide in order to make the issue bigger and to convince people that you've really got a substantive contribution. It's an important topic, but the more you do that, the wider you go, the less focused it is. And so it's the more difficult for people to see what it is that you're going to contribute. Yeah. Okay. Okay, methods experimental. As I said, this section here, depending upon the type of data you're using, you may have the data separate from the methods. The methods, I think, one thing I would say is you don't want to teach people the methods. Yeah, I see that sometimes a mistake which is made. There are textbooks that teach techniques. You don't have to write the textbook. Yeah, So you want to tell people what method you have used, and you want to tell them in a way which is accurate, such that they know exactly what you have done. Yeah, but you don't have to reteach them the method. They can go elsewhere and learn the method. Yeah, so I think this is a difficulty that people run into, and I think it's often a difficulty because actually the better you know the method, the easier it will be for you to write about it very concisely, effectively. Yeah. If you don't know the method very well, you're probably going to write more. Yeah. And that's not going to make a good impression. Yeah. So no questions on that. I'll move on. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So good. Well done. So this is one of the things that I would also disagree with. Yeah. So, yeah, two things here. Yeah. So pass is active. Yeah, I would go active. I think that's the norm, and certainly in economics, that's what we would do. And the second thing here, past tense. No, I would go present tense. Yeah. But if I was writing for a public health journal, I would go past tense, or a medical journal. Yeah, so that's you know, it's cultures, it's norms. You got to respect those. Yeah. Yeah.
So, question about the method. If you're using sort of a relatively new method, sometimes I find that a reviewer might tell you that you didn't give enough information, but what you're saying is that you want to keep it to a manageable size. How do you strike that balance?
Yeah. Okay. So I think you want to talk a lot about the method if you're doing something innovative, if you're making a methodological contribution. Yeah. Now, I would say within health economics, it's pretty rare to find a methodological contribution. Most papers are applications. By far, a majority of most of papers are applications. Yeah. So for that reason, you don't want, I think, to emphasize the method too much, because if you do that, then the readers are going to be expecting you to be doing something new. And if you don't deliver that, then you've got a problem. Yeah, you got to, whatever you promise, you've got to deliver. Yeah. Now, the other thing there is that new methods, particularly nowadays, they get picked up very, very quickly. So something that you think is new and sexy and innovative and frontier, before long, everyone's doing it. Yeah. So let's take an example. Like in the last 5 years or so, probably the main, I think, development in empirical economics is new methods and differences. Yeah. And particularly for like staggered exposure to treatment and all the problems that arise from that. And we've got lots of new methods coming out to deal with that. Yeah. But that whole literature, I mean, that's just moved so fast. Yeah. And so nowadays, like a journal of health economics now, we would not accept a difference in differences paper, which had staggered exposure to treatment and was not using one of these new methods. We would just reject it if it was not doing that, the desk reject stage. Yeah. Given that, if someone was to submit a paper and claim that one of the contributions of the paper is that they're using one of these new staggered different methods, that's just not going to work. Yeah. So be very aware that the things are moving very, very fast. Yeah. So, you know, you need to be extremely fast in order to sell your paper on those grounds, I think.
So generally, how do you sort of err? Like you say here, you can get rejected if you don't include enough, but obviously you want to be as concise as possible. And maybe I'll give an example. So I've seen a lot for like health equity papers. People will say, I used the cone index command, which I've never really seen in epidemiology papers saying which command you use. So how do you sort of choose, and like what is the norm? Maybe even specifically for that one.
Yeah. So again, this differs again between the disciplines. So the sort of the norm, the culture within economics is that we would not say which statistical package we are using. We would not say which commands we are using. For better or worse, that's the sort of culture. And so for economics journals, I wouldn't do it. But in medical journals, you do. So I think it just completely depends upon which journal you're going for.
Thanks.
Perhaps we should move. Perhaps we can save the question for later because we're running a little bit behind time, I think. Okay, results. I don't think we can skip over this, I think, and go to tables and figures because perhaps this is important. These are important. This is where, I mean, for empirical papers, this is where the meat is in the tables and figures. And just one thing to highlight here, try to make them good. And what I mean there is make them very, particularly I talk about tables, yeah? Make sure your tables are very clear, yeah? And easy to read. That means not too much in them. They're not cluttered, yeah? Look at papers, you know, sort of good papers in top journals, and you'll see that a lot of thought has gone into how they produce the tables, yeah? And try to do that. And the main point, I think, is don't put too much in, yeah? It should be very easy to work out what's there. Discussion. Okay, so I skipped over the results, and perhaps that's a mistake. So just quickly, so the role of this results section and a discussion section. So again, this is a big difference between economics and public health, yeah, and medicine. So in public health and medicine, in your results section, it would all be statement of what the results are with zero interpretation, yeah, no interpretation whatsoever. And all the interpretation would go into the discussion section, yeah. And economics is different. In economics, you will have some interpretation, well, quite a bit of interpretation within the results section. You'll tell people the sort of meaning of the coefficients. You won't just say what the coefficients are, yeah? How to interpret the coefficients. Okay, so when in the discussion section, what do we do in the discussion section then in an economics paper? There you're going broader, yeah? So you're not just interpreting your results, but you're telling the readers how your results relate to other results, the evidence base. What are you changing in the evidence base, yeah? And then on top of that, you're also telling people about the limitations of your evidence and analysis, yeah? And you're also talking about the policy implications or the research implications. Yeah, so I regret it a little bit. The implications of your study could be policy, could be research, does not have to be both, does not have to necessarily be policy. Yeah. So like if you've not got direct policy implications, don't make a weak claim for a policy implication. Yeah. Hopefully you've got some implication. Yeah. So either research or policy, but you don't have to make a very, very sort of weak claim for policy, which is just not going to sell well. And then conclusions, well, it depends. As I said earlier, you could either have these two sections separately. Sometimes you'll have them all together. If you do have them separately, then the conclusion section should be really, really short. It should be one paragraph, no more. References. Yes, it says here, get them right. Do get them right. It's a bad sort of signal if the reference list is very messy or incomplete. Yeah, and it's an easy. Why should you lose a point there? Just don't do it. Yeah. Supplementary material we make much more use of supplementary material now because of technology, because of online publication. So for example, now I would push any author to put almost all appendix material into supplementary material. Only if they have a very short appendix would I allow them to leave that in the main paper, but otherwise everything would get shifted into supplementary material. And I mean, you've got a lot that you can add there. You should, I think we should think about how we publish very differently because of the technology that we now have. You can give authors a lot of additional material on your paper, and you can help get your paper recognized and used, perhaps, using that supplementary material. You can use it to make it easier for others to access your data or your estimation, for them to use those estimations in their own work, and that'll get you citations. That can only work to your advantage. Yeah. Okay, so that's that.
Thank you very much. I'm going to skip through some of the slides a little bit quickly, so I want to make sure Joe has some time at the end to do the sort of like top tips. So this next section's on authorship. Sorry, I'm going to have to skip over this one, but maybe something for you to consider to have a chat about afterwards. So, authorship, who's allowed to be an author? Well, policies regarding authorships can vary, but this is the most common example of the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, who declared that an author must firstly substantially contribute to the paper. You see there the sections. Should be involved in the drafting and revision of the article and give their approval for the final full version, and agree to be accountable for all aspects of the work. So these are some authorship's do's and don'ts. So general principles on who is listed first. This varies between disciplines. So in this instance, it's giving the example, the first author conducts and supervises data analysis and proper presentation, interpretation results, puts the paper together and submits the paper. So is also normally the corresponding author, and the co-authors make intellectual contributions, review the draft of the papers, and must be able to present the results, defend the implications, and discuss the limitations. On the don'ts, things to be avoided, ghost authors, so overlooking and leaving out authors who should be included, and including scientific writers or gift authors, so including authors when they didn't contribute to the paper. Now, the peer review process. I think this is you, Joe, isn't it? Or is it Owen? I think it's you again, Owen, sorry. Apologies.
Okay, so what happens once you submit your paper? So you submit it. What happens at both Social Science and Medicine and Journal of Health Economics? It would appear in a system like this, and at Social Science and Medicine, Joe or Richard would see the paper pop up in this format here, and then I would see it at Journal of Health Economics. So at Journal of Health Economics, what we do is we have a number of editors, and then we have one allocating editor who sees all the papers immediately, and that allocating editor, currently I'm in that role, will make decisions on desk rejects or not. So and then if it's not desk reject, allocate to another editor. Yeah. So in this system, what we can do is we can bring up the paper and start to read through all the material that you have submitted. Yeah. And what we're going to be doing when we're doing that is thinking, okay, is it going to be a desk reject, or am I going to either send it to reviewers in Joe's case, or in my case, send it to another editor? And so what are we thinking about? Well, I would be thinking about three things. First, I'll think, well, is it a fit for the Journal of Health Economics? And we mentioned at the very start of the session, what would make it a fit and what would not make it a fit for the Journal of Health Economics. We get a lot of papers that are not at all a good fit. And my impression is that most of those could be avoided if people just went to the website and looked at the articles that are being published in the Journal of Health Economics and considered how close their paper is to that type of article. And I think, you know, I would think a big proportion of the papers we get, if they did that, they would not submit the paper. So it's an easy thing to do. Then, okay, if it's a fit, then it's two questions that are then remaining about whether it's going to go to review or not. The first question is, okay, is this going to be, does this have the potential to make a substantial contribution to the field of health economics? So how important is the paper? And that's going to be important in relation to the evidence that it's presenting in the paper, or if it's a theory paper, how important is the new theoretical result that it has. So contribution is the second thing. And then third thing is the validity of the evidence. Okay, so is it an interesting question? And then beyond that, is the strategy which is being used to provide this evidence, is this a valid strategy? You know? So there's a chance to be valid. So those three things, fit, contribution, and validity of the evidence, basically are the criteria for deciding whether it goes out to review or not. Okay, so then if it's not that's rejected, we're going to look for reviewers, and this can be difficult at times. Everybody's got a shortage of time, and so it's perhaps quite difficult to get reviewers. How are we going to find reviewers? Well, partly it's going to be just, I think, from our own knowledge of who's working in an area. So, you know, if I get a paper in a particular area, I'll be just thinking through my own brain to try to think of ideas, of names of who would be good reviewers for this paper. And the other thing that we would tend to do, or I would certainly do, is I will look very carefully at the reference list, and I will probably, you know, consider very closely that reference list and whether there are good ideas of reviewers for people who are publishing, you know, closely related papers. We have search tools provided within the software. We can search for reviewers. Matt's probably going to get upset with me at this point, I'm not sure, but like I very rarely use that search tool. It'll give me lots and lots of names, but then I'll have to go through those names, and most of them I'm not going to find are actually particularly good suggestions. So that's just the way it is. I'm sure. Yeah. Okay. Then we'll get comments back from the reviewers, and sometimes, quite a lot of time, there will be agreement in the comments, and that makes it easy for us. So if both are saying, usually it's two, if we get two rejects, then that's certainly going to be a reject. And if we get two very enthusiastic accepts or revisions, then it might be a revision. And if we get one saying reject and one saying accept, then we are going to read the paper very, very carefully and make a decision. Yeah. Editors, I think on the whole, if a paper is going to be considered seriously for acceptance, then their editor will read the paper themselves and make that decision. Okay, so then there's the decision, and you're either going to get a reject, or you're going to get a revise and resubmit, or you're very rarely, in the first instance, you're going to get accepted. Yeah. I'm going quickly because we're running out of time, I think. Major, minor revision, I don't think this is so important, actually. I think it's very subjective. You know, some reviewers will say major revision, some reviewers will say minor revision. I think they're using different scales to say what's a major revision and what's a minor revision. So I would not pay actually so much attention to this distinction. A revision is a revision. Yeah. Okay. Revision is extremely important. Yeah. If you get an invitation to revise your paper, you want to make sure that it counts. Yeah. So you want to take it extremely. I think in most cases, if you get an invitation to revise your paper, if you take it seriously and you do the job diligently, then it should end up with a success. Yeah, you should get published. If you don't take it seriously, and either the reviewers or the editor thinks you're trying to do the minimum or even not quite enough, then it can go wrong. Yeah, so just do it very diligently, seriously, and you should, in most cases, be okay. So what that would mean is, write a separate response note where I would be looking for, reproduce, copy and paste, as it says here, the reviewer's comment, directly after the reviewer's comment, what you have done in response to that comment. And I do mean what you have done. Try to avoid going into a sort of long discussion of issues arising from this very interesting issue that the referee has raised, without leading directly to saying what it is precisely you have done in response. Yeah, when I'm looking, I want to see what's been changed. Or if you've got an argument not to change anything, then very directly saying why you're not changing something, why you think the reviewers got it wrong. Yeah, so be very directed in that response. Okay. A reviewer. So I'm looking for a reviewer to tell me two things, basically. One, how important is the contribution? So usually the reviewers will be more specialized than the editor, so they should know the particular area of research much better than the editor, and so they can better identify what's the precise contribution of this paper to this particular area of research. Yeah. So I want the reviewers to tell me how important this is. And secondly, I want them to tell me how valid the evidence is. So, particularly with sort of empirical econometrics type papers, it's quite involved. Editor can't look at everything closely. And so you're relying on the editors to have, the reviewers to have a very good close look at the methods, what's been done, and tell us whether you think that the evidence at the end of the day is valid or not, yeah, robust or not. Yeah. That's the two things I think a reviewer should be doing. And there's some materials here you can learn more about being a reviewer. Okay.
Okay. So I'm just going to cover briefly on publication ethics. And there are a few things which you should avoid. The three most common forms of ethical misconduct are fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism, all to be avoided. Plagiarism. So I'm sure you all know what plagiarism is. Most journals will have a built-in plagiarism checker. So papers are flagged up where it looks like there's been plagiarism. It basically is taken very seriously. There are entire processes which editors and publishers follow when plagiarism is identified, and it can be considered a very serious issue, offence by your institute, as well as the editors and the community. It can cause rejection of your paper, of course, and it can have a bad hit your reputation very badly in the community. And there's an example there of what happened to a German education minister who was caught having carried out plagiarism. Duplicate publication, it's also called self-plagiarism. And this is when there are two or more papers without proper references sharing the same hypothesis, data, discussion points, or conclusions. Again, this is flagged up within systems as duplication. And authors should not submit a previously published paper to another journal. They shouldn't be repeated. Republication of paper in another language is acceptable, provided there's a full disclosure of the original source. And if there, at the time of submission, there are any related papers, even if it's in a different language or in press, it should be disclosed, and this includes translations. I've mentioned the detection tools that we have. We have two: Turnitin and Authenticate. Papers are checked against a database, 50 million and growing. So it is picked up, but it's also picked up by more traditional approach, editors and reviewers, and so on. Sometimes we get messages from reviewers saying, I've seen a paper very similar to this, which I was asked to review by another journal. And then that immediately triggers an investigation. I'm not going to go through all of this, but it's an example of plagiarism. And what happens? Papers get retracted. So a paper is not removed. It's still in the public domain, but it has got a great big stamp across it saying it's retracted. So anybody who downloads it, anybody who goes to look for it will find that it has been retracted and why. So there'll be a reason stated. And this is across all publishers. I'm not going to go through every single line of this because hopefully these slides will be circulated to everybody afterwards. But Elsevier has got a very new policy about generative AI and about how authors can use it within the writing process. Basically, the policy states that AI can be used to improve readability and language, but it needs to be disclosed. And use of the technology should only be done with human oversight and control, because it can generate authoritative sounding text, which can be incorrect, it can be wrong. And you should not list generative AI or AI assisted technologies as an author or co-author. People have done it, please don't. We've also got policy around the use of generative AI in figures, images, and artwork. So we don't permit the use of generative AI or AI assisted tools to create or alter images in submitted manuscripts. Imaging forensic software might be applied in the future. We're looking at this to identify any irregularities like this. The only exception here is when it's been used as part of the research design or research methods. But again, this would need to be explained. And we don't allow the use of AI or tools to use artwork such as journal covers or graphical abstracts, which some journals encourage. I talked about think, check, submit earlier. I'm just going to come back to it now. It's a tool, it's a free site. You can use it. It will give you guidance and advice on identifying appropriate journals. It is available in many different languages. So I know we've got quite an international audience. Have a look. You'll find it's pretty comprehensive. There are companies that offer services who promise they will get you published. We like to get papers from people directly. And if somebody tells you that they can guarantee that you're going to get published, be very, very cautious, because the likelihood is what they will do is take some money from you, and that may be the end of the process for you. Peer review takes a long time. You know, we try and be as fast as we can, but to do a proper job, papers need to be read and reviewed by multiple people. So anything which sounds too good to be true probably is. So just a word of warning there. So I'm just going to move on to some resources because I want to give Joe a chance to finish off in a moment. Journal Finder I've touched on already, so I'm not going to go through that again, but you can upload your abstract to find places to potentially publish. Researcher Academy is something which I recommend everybody takes a look at. It's a completely free tool, free website with lots of training courses about the entire process of publishing, from preparing your research, writing, the publication process itself, some of the things we've touched on already, navigating peer review and training on how to become a peer reviewer, and then how to communicate your research. So some of this is also available in different languages as well, but completely free. You just need to register to use it. So there's just some of the examples of some of the courses. Copy editing services. So you may want to use a service to improve the language in your paper. Most publishers offer this. I would say check first with your university. A lot do offer it internally, but people don't necessarily know about it. But this is an example of one, University of Rwanda academic writing support. So, you know, have a look, talk to your librarian, talk to your supervisor. Do you have this at your institution? Because it can help. It can help get your paper over the line. Research for Life, I touched on this earlier with relation to open access, but Research for Life also gives access, free access to books and journals. 200 international publishers support the initiative. Just in Africa, 2,000 institutions have registered for Research for Life, and you can see the breakdown of some of the countries there. And this gives completely free access to what is subscription or paid for content. So again, check with your librarian. If you are in a country, low and middle income country that may have access, ask, because there's thousands of free journals out there. So I will now pass over to Joe to talk very quickly.
Yeah, I'm going to be. How do I make this work? What am I supposed to be pressing? So you can get to be a senior academic and still be completely rubbish at using these things. Okay, I wasn't expecting it to do that. So I thought I'd start off just, basically a lot of the things that are in these slides we've already covered, so I'm not going to pick up on everything, but I'll just pick up on the extra bits. When I was first an academic, my boss had two bits of advice that have really stayed with me throughout all of my writing. The first one was every paper needs a peg to hang it on. So that's the idea that you need to know clearly what the research gap is that you're trying to fill and what your research question is trying to address. So it's about having a phrase in your paper that says something like this paper aims to, or the hypothesis tested in this paper is, because I can't tell you how many papers I get where I get to the end of the introduction and I have no idea what the paper's about. Okay, so you really want to be clear about what it is that your paper's about. And the other thing I would say that was another piece of advice that I've carried with me is this idea of one paper, one point. So you don't want to have 15 aims in your paper. So something like this paper looks at preferences for performance-based financing in 3 countries. It also considers whether the best worst scaling method can be used with different stakeholders. It also questions how many scenarios should be used. Finally, it compares values from best worst scaling with willingness to pay. It's too much. You know, you want a clear message from your paper. Certainly, that's what I'm looking for. So avoid writing a report rather than a paper. Don't try and cram your 80,000 word thesis into a paper. One bit of advice I have for people who are writing up their PhD is don't start with your thesis. Start with a blank piece of paper and bring things in from your thesis. If you try and cut down your thesis, it'll feel terrible because every word that you've spent all that time writing, you don't want to get rid of. So it's really difficult. So I would just say, start with a blank piece of paper if that's what you're doing. Understand the contribution of your paper, how your work advances the literature. I think we've talked about most of this already, but make sure you're choosing the right journal for your particular piece of work. Few common mistakes in the writing: not making your research gap clear enough, trying to do too many things, not making your contribution clear enough. Also, poor presentation. Try to proofread your paper before you send it off. It's a really fantastic paper. Don't let it down by having really poor proofreading. And the other thing I would say, and I think maybe that is maybe more for social science and medicine than perhaps some of these other more economicsy journals, but the discussion is really important. And having a poor discussion that basically just repeats the findings rather than doing all those things that Owen was talking about, setting it in the context of the literature, looking at the strengths and limitations, looking at the implications for policy and implications for research. I would actually start with that almost as a sort of set of headings in your mind, even if they don't go into the journal paper, but making sure that you're covering all of those areas is useful, I think. Be aware of journal policies. We've already talked about the preprint thing, so I won't go into that again. But another one that's really important for social science and medicine is that if you're doing work with human subjects, you have to have ethics approval or a formal exemption. It is not enough, and I get this a lot from people in economics departments, to say we weren't collecting data in health and therefore we don't need ethics approval. If you're doing any work with human subjects, then you need ethics approval. Also, just be aware, as Matt said, that we do cross-check for potential plagiarism. I would say proper plagiarism is probably pretty unusual. In the years I've been an editor, I've had 2 papers, one of which was a complete copy and paste of a paper, and one of which was 4 papers joined together. Mostly it's about poor academic practice, so not properly referencing, not using quote marks if you're using direct speech, but be careful about that. Not engaging with the peer review process. So we do ask with social science and medicine for you to suggest reviewers. I think that's a really helpful thing for you to do. I don't know what Owen's experience is, but I mean, I can try 25 people to get two reviews on a paper. Sometimes it is useful to have your suggestions, but avoid ones that have Hotmail addresses or Google type addresses, because we have no idea, that could be you or someone you know. So make sure you've got an academic email address. Don't suggest people from your own institution. So many people suggest people from their own institution. They have an automatic conflict of interest, so you don't want to do that. When you're doing your responses to the peer review process, if you haven't got time, let us know. Almost always I accept requests to extend the time, particularly if it's something like maternity leave or illness or something like that, or caring duties. When you're addressing the reviewer comments, be respectful. You know, these people have spent a lot of time putting effort into reading your paper. They don't get paid for it. So, yeah, just be polite in your response. I would say engage by doing mostly what they've asked and clearly justifying when you don't do what they've asked, why you're doing that. I absolutely agree with Owen's point about copying and pasting the review comments and then responding to each one. What you're trying to do is make the reviewers and editors' lives as easy as possible so they can really quickly and easily find where you've responded. It's really unhelpful, actually, when you get the sort of responses that say, I am summarizing what the reviewer has said to make this point, and then you can't tell whether they've really answered the question or not without going back to the original reviews. Final thing I wanted to say is about if your paper is rejected. We all get papers rejected. But I think for the most part, it's the exception that work is really unpublishable. So if you get rejected, yes, it's disappointing, but you should be immediately thinking, okay, where do I send this paper next? Journals may offer a transfer or a switch to another journal. Elsevier does that. They're very keen on it. I'm sort of keen on it, but sometimes I think sticking with the same publisher is not necessarily the best thing for you and your career. You might be better going to a different journal that's published by a different publisher. So think a little bit about whether the offer of a transfer is really that useful for you. Generally, I would say take a little bit of time before resubmitting. Don't just dismiss the reviewer's comments, even if they've got the wrong end of the stick. Usually they've got the wrong end of the stick because you haven't explained clearly enough what the issue is. So just make sure that you look at their comments, because you'll end up having a better paper to submit to the next journal if you take account of them. So yes, make revisions before sending it out again. And I think that was it. So I think we're supposed to have a panel now, but we're already 6 minutes over.
Well, do we have time for questions? I'm not sure if we're going to be thrown out. Nobody's telling me we haven't got time. Okay.
not sure if there is a good answer to this question, but it's something that I always think about. So are we ever going to get to the utopia, and I describe it as that, where the formatting of different journals are synchronized? Because what happens is that you've mentioned the percentage of 70% is even higher in some of your journals. What the authors try to do is to go to another, and then you have to go and read the instructions again and format that over a couple of days and submit again with the same high risk that you're facing before. So the man hours that are spent in actually just changing the format of the paper from one journal to the other is incredible.
I agree. And social science and medicine does have a thing that allows you to submit without doing that. But I would slightly caution against it because it sort of feels like, okay, this paper has already been rejected from somewhere else. So I know it's been rejected because you haven't formatted it in the style for the journal. So yeah, I think if you can, it's probably better. But I know with the transfer process as well that they presumably they don't ask, I'm asking Matt here, presumably they don't ask you to reformat everything?
Well, there will be reformatting it, but I mean, the other thing with the transfer process, it has to take into consideration things like word count. So yes, it's an interesting bit of feedback. I'll take that back. Thank you.
I think the other thing is if you can, when you're deciding where to submit your paper originally, I often identify not just one journal, but a journal and then the backup journal and the backup journal. And I try and make those as similar as possible in terms of things like word count so that you don't have to do all that reformatting. Because I start from the position that not every paper is going to get accepted, and therefore it's worth actually having your backup in mind to start with.
Okay, well, I'd like to say thank you very much to Joe and Owen for their participation. If anybody does want to come up to us and ask any questions, I think we'll probably be around, or you'll see us over the next few days. So thank you very much for coming. Much appreciated. Thanks to everybody who joined online as well. So I hope you found it useful today, and thank you.